We've seen men die by the hundreds of thousands as Europe has been ripped apart in just half a year. New battlefronts have been opened to gain any advantage, and soldiers come from all around the world to die, while new technology has taken the war to the skies and beneath the seas. Technology now turns to close combat as this week, new weapons make their appearance for the first time, including one of the most feared of them all, the flamethrower. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, we saw the British and French expand the war by bombing the Turks at the Dardanelles. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had begun a second winter offensive against the Russians in the mountains, while far to the north, the Germans had officially halted their offensive against the Russians after weeks of heavy fighting. In the west, it was death as usual, but with the French and British making slight headway against the Germans. The Western Front was a stalemate, but it wasn't stagnant, for more and more British troops were arriving throughout the winter and spring, and they would soon be able to take over stretches of the line from the French and even mount their own offensives. But where would this happen? How would one choose a line of advance that would bring about a big German withdrawal? Well, the British and French had been seriously analyzing that problem for weeks, and they saw that it all hinged on the rail communications that supplied the German army. Now, there were three rail systems that led back across the Rhine River into Germany. The one furthest to the south was the shortest and was also the most easily defended, so they looked at the other two that supplied the huge German salient between Flanders and Verdun. If either of those were cut, they reasoned, then the German troops in the salient would have to fall back, and you might create, once again, the conditions of open warfare that pretty much everyone believed was a necessary prerequisite for gaining a decisive victory. So the 1915 battle strategy was going to be offensives at the edges of the salient. In the north, against the Awaaz and Vimy ridges that protected the German railways in the plain behind them, and in the south, against the Champagne Heights that protected the Mézières-Hirson railway line. A best-case scenario would be that the attacks managed to converge, which would not only cut off the railway lines, but would surround the German troops. So the British and French agreed on this as the main plans for the spring offensives. The French, though, were actually still in the middle of their winter offensive, the Champagne offensive that had been on since December, and they were actually making a bit of headway this week. This week, they were advancing from Perthes and managed to take 2 kilometers of new ground from the Germans and dig new front lines in front of their old positions between Perthes and Beauséjour. All German counterattacks were repulsed. That's a big deal on the Western Front. There was also real foreshadowing this week in the West of horrors to come as new weapons of war made their appearances for the first time. On February 26, German soldiers used flamethrowers for the first time in battle against French trenches near Verdun. This was the first of over 650 flamethrower attacks, though it was ineffective. 3 days later, German troops tried advancing behind an armored shield for the first time. This was also ineffective as they lost about half their number. That same day, March 1st, French troops were issued with grenades for the first time. The warring nations were looking for any advantage, a new weapon, a surprise attack, even a foolhardy plan, anything to beat the enemy, and the Austrians were no different from anybody else. The Second Carpathian winter offensive had just kicked into gear, as the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army tried once again to knock the Russians out of the mountain passes and break the siege at Przemysl to free the Austrian army that was trapped there and now running out of food and supplies. From the beginning, this offensive seemed as doomed as the first, even though, according to historian James Scudieri, this was the only occasion on which the Austrians really did have numerical superiority over the Russians, 41 divisions strong. But the men were exhausted, many having fought in the frozen mountains for 6 weeks already, and illness and frostbite were rampant. In addition, the Russians strategically fell back from the initial assault, and the Austrians overextended the few supply lines they had. On March 1st, Colonel Veit of the Austrian Third Army wrote, quote, "Fog and heavy snowfalls. We have lost all sense of direction. Entire regiments are getting lost, resulting in catastrophic losses." End quote. There were, though, for a change, reinforcements being sent to the front as the offensive unfolded. But the center and the left flank both collapsed under Russian pressure, and the reinforcements were just thrown in haphazardly wherever there were gaps, and they basically traveled all the way to the Carpathians to become cannon fodder. But throughout the week, the assault continued, with the Austrians being repulsed daily, and the week ended with the Russians crossing the Bistritsa in the eastern Carpathians and threatening the Austrian right flank. If some of you are wondering why the name Bistritsa sounds vaguely familiar, it's because that's where Count Dracula used to hang out. Well, in books. But I think it's fairly safe to say that if you were in the Austrian army and had been driven out of tiny Serbia a few times in humiliation, beaten at the River San while a marching band played and you were bombed by your own side, and had now spent 7 weeks in the freezing mountains in cardboard shoes fighting Siberian soldiers, and all of a sudden, on top of it, Dracula turned up, you wouldn't be surprised. I seriously doubt it. You'd say, what? Oh, Count Dracula's here, you say? Oh, whatever. I mean, you had seen pretty much everything there was to see. And one thing we had certainly seen again and again during the war was forts being bombed and destroyed with ease by the frightening power of modern artillery. And that would continue this week, although in a new location, the newest front in the war, in the eastern Mediterranean, where throughout the week, the bombing of the forts of the Dardanelles that guarded the entrance to the Black Sea continued, as it had since February 19th by the British and French navies, only now it was the inner forts being destroyed, the outer forts having been reduced last week. There was also action much further to the east this week, a Turkish threat to the British oil in the Middle East at the Battle of Awaaz in Persia. British and Indian troops advanced and attacked the enemy at their camp at Gadir, 15 kilometers to the northwest of the British base. The British suddenly found themselves greatly outnumbered, but they managed to fight and withdraw, protected by their artillery until reserves could arrive from the base and rescue them. Although this was a daring and perhaps even foolish attack on the British part, it served its purpose, for there were no further serious attacks on the pipeline, and the Turks withdrew towards Amara. One other thing here. People have asked us about the use of cavalry during the war. Well, here, it was the Indian cavalry who saved the day, consistently charging into the enemy riflemen and saving the British infantry. And that was the week. Indian cavalry showing their mettle in Persia, the Ottoman Empire being bombarded not far from its capital, the Austrians being beaten back again and again high in the frozen mountains, the Allies gaining new ground in the west and preparing for spring offensives, and the flamethrower. The flamethrower. That's how far we'd come in such a short time. It wasn't enough to drop bombs from the sky on civilians. It wasn't enough to declare that merchant ships could be mercilessly torpedoed and their crews sent helplessly to drown. And it wasn't enough to send hundreds of thousands of men to be chopped down by machine guns across Europe. No, that wasn't enough. Now you had poison gas. Now you had flamethrowers, both in their infancy at the moment, but both to soon see far greater use. And you want to know something? For the people running this war, poison gas and flamethrowers wouldn't be enough either. There would come ever newer and ever more effective ways to kill people. This was modern war. But human beings were not the only ones being killed in this giant slaughterhouse called the Great War. A lot of the logistics of World War I relied on animals. We made a special episode about these essential helpers at the front, and you can check it out right here. If you want more in-depth discussion about our show, check out our subreddit. And now that spring is on the horizon, please show our show at your next barbecue to get your neighbors and friends hooked. See you next week.